My name is Brian Gillis, and I am a doctoral candidate in human development and family science, not family studies. And today I am going to talk about the importance of consistent bedtimes, which is important for all of us, but I want to focus especially today and talk about the ways that it is especially good for teenage night owls. So you may remember from your teenage years that there was a time when you started wanting to stay awake later at night and probably also sleep in a bit later in the mornings or maybe on the weekends a lot later. This phenomenon is accompanied by a distinct yet related concept called circadian preference, which is our internal sense of being more alert, either in the evenings or in the mornings. So we often refer to those evening types as night owls, a phrase you're probably familiar with. But what you may not know about night owls is that they are at risk for a range of developmental problems, including externalizing symptoms like depression and anxiety, externalizing problems like rule-breaking behaviors or aggression, as well as poor physical health. And this has been demonstrated time and again in the literature. And one of the most common explanations for it is that they're simply not getting enough sleep. Because especially if you think of those teenage years while you're in high school, you may stay awake later at night if you're a night owl, but you still have to wake up at the same time for school the next morning. And so maybe it's just crunch of not getting enough sleep that's an issue. But there's hope in this situation. We have found, the broader scientific community has found that consistency in sleep timing is one thing that may be protective against such outcomes, especially for night owls. So what I wanted to examine in this project was to find out if consistency in weeknight sleep schedule could protect night owls against poor mental and physical health. To test this hypothesis, we utilized a sample of 272 high school students in grades 10, 11, and 12. And we had them complete a survey to tell us, using this well-established scale, if they are more of a morning or more of an evening person. They also wore an actigraph, which is like a Fitbit, at home for 1 week, which told us what time, the exact time that they were falling asleep. Their parents reported on youth mental health, again, using a well-established survey. Youth reported to us on their levels of subjective happiness, just how happy they feel they are in comparison to other people around them or other people their age. And youth also reported to us on their general health, if they feel like they are generally more healthy or less healthy. Within our models, we also controlled for the times that they were falling asleep during the week and on the weekends, as well as the number of minutes that they were getting to sleep each night. I should have said on that sleep timing, it's not just the time that they fell asleep, but it's the consistency in that, the variability that we were measuring. Just to give you a sense, about half the sample reported being more on the morning side and the other half more on the evening side. We didn't categorize them into those groups. We use them continuously across that scale, but just to give you a sense of how it shakes out. We also found that the youth fell asleep a little bit after 11 p.m. On weeknights. Those are school nights, which is pretty wild to think about. Even in high school, the adolescents are staying awake that late. And on the weekends, they were falling asleep about an hour later, just after midnight. And when we fit our model, we found that indeed that circadian preference was related, consistent with previous literature, to our developmental outcomes, meaning that night owls had higher internalizing symptoms, higher externalizing problems, lower happiness, and lower physical health. To get a sense of that direction there on that circadian preference scale, morningness is the higher number, which is why those signs seem reversed from what I just said. But importantly, what we wanted to look at was the interaction between that circadian preference and variability in weeknight sleep onset. You can see at the bottom there that all four of the outcomes had this significant interaction, at least marginally. And when we plot the interactions, this is what we find. Consistent with previous literature, there is greater risk for eveningness types, but only when they had more variability in their sleep onset. What we found is that if they were able to fall asleep at about the same time every night, that this risk was mitigated substantially, a full standard deviation difference for the eveningness types when they were getting more consistent bedtimes versus less consistent bedtimes. And for morningless people, for more morning types, there was less of this disparity. And this particular plot is looking at symptoms of depression and anxiety. We see quite a similar pattern when we examine externalizing problems. Again, this would be things like rule breaking or aggressive behavior. And so we find that when eveningness types, those night owls, are able to get more consistent sleep, there is a full standard deviation lower of these problems going on for them. Similar patterns emerge both for happiness and physical health, which we can see here on the right side of the screen. You can see from the colors, it appears as if these graphs are flipped, and in fact they are, because here on happiness and physical health, the higher scores are representing something that's more positive, whereas on the left, that was something more negative. And so we see once again that when those night owls have less variability, they are substantially better off here in terms of their happiness and physical health. So what does all this mean? Well, again, consistent with previous literature, this shows us that morning types on average have moderate levels of wellness, looking at these multiple dimensions, regardless of their variability and onset. But eveningness types have significant variability based on the regularity of their sleep schedules. So those eveningness types, or night owls with inconsistent sleep schedules, were at highest risk for internalizing symptoms, externalizing behavior, lower happiness, and poor physical health, while those with consistent schedules had average levels on all indicators, more comparable to the morning types. So this tells us that a consistent sleep onset time or consistent bedtime seems to be protective against negative outcomes. And what I find especially important about this study were some of those controls that we put in there. So in addition to looking at that variability, we also controlled for the time that they were falling asleep on the weeknights, as well as on the weekends. And so this tells us that even if adolescents do stay awake a bit later during the week than maybe we would like them to, they are still able to get this protection if they fall asleep at approximately the same time every night. So even if it's later, but if they can get that consistency in just on the weeknights, that is able to be protective for them. And then it also still holds true, even looking at the time that they fall asleep on the weekends. And that's especially important because we know that it would be fantastic if we could convince every teenager to fall asleep exactly at 9 p.m. every night of the week. But it's simply not realistic, right? Their lives naturally lead to the fact that they're going to stay awake a bit later on the weekends. And while we don't advocate for them doing that necessarily, what this does mean is that even if they do stay awake a bit later on the weekends, if they can get those weeknight bedtimes to be consistent for night owls, and again, it can be a late bedtime, but as long as it's consistent, they're protected against this wide range of negative and positive developmental outcomes. And another exciting point about this is that this would be a free intervention. This is not something that requires even necessarily much more research to implement, though it would be nice to know exactly, how much wiggle room those adolescents have, and that could be a future direction that we look at here. But it's really cool that this is something that any youth could do free of charge to help themselves out. So with that, I will go ahead and stop. Thank you for your time.